The kingdom on the edge. The coast of Angola wakes up slowly, like a great animal stretching in the sun. Morning mist clings to the wide rivers. Parrots argue in the trees. Fishermen push wooden boats into dark, patient water. The land is green and rich and humming with life, the kind of place that looks peaceful only to people who don't know its history. Far inland, kingdoms rise and fall beneath tall grasses and heavy skies. Ndongo, Matamba, Congo, names spoken with pride, with power, with the confidence of people who have ruled themselves for generations. These are not quiet lands. They are lands of warriors and farmers, markets and music, drums that speak messages across miles. But out on the horizon something new has appeared. Ships. Tall, pale ships with foreign flags snapping in the salty wind. Men with strange languages and sharper ambitions. They arrive carrying Bibles and barrels of gunpowder, trade goods and chains, promises and lies all bundled together. The Portuguese say they have come to bring God and commerce. The people of Angola quickly learn what they really bring: greed, hunger, and an endless appetite for human bodies to ship across the ocean. Villages begin to vanish. Families disappear into the bellies of boats. Treaties are signed with smiling faces and broken before the ink is dry. An entire world begins to tilt toward disaster. Empires, after all, never knock politely. And in the middle of this tightening storm, in a royal compound, surrounded by tall walls and taller expectations, a girl is growing up who will one day refuse to be afraid of any of it. Her name is Nzinga. Right now she is only a princess, quick-eyed, sharp-tongued, listening to the men around her argue about war and trade as if the future is just another game to be played. But she is paying attention. She notices the way Portuguese captains speak to African kings as if they are already conquered. She notices the way promises change shape from one meeting to the next. She notices that power, real power, does not come from titles. It comes from knowing when to speak and when to strike. The adults see a clever child. History is about to meet something very different. A strategist, a survivor, a queen who will look at the might of Europe and calmly say, no. To understand how she became that woman, you have to begin where she began, in a kingdom balanced on the edge of a blade. Born into a world of storms. Nzinga arrived in a kingdom already holding its breath. She was born to the royal family of Ndongo, a place of proud traditions and older loyalties, where ancestors were honored and rulers were expected to be strong enough to protect their people. Drums announced her birth. Elders offered blessings. Life began, as life so often does, with hope. But hope in Angola had begun to feel fragile. By the time Nzinga could walk, Portuguese traders were no longer just visitors on the coast. They were bargainers, schemers, and increasingly masters of the slave trade that gnawed at the edges of every African kingdom in reach. Children learned to fear ships the way other children fear storms. Her father, the Ngola, the king, spent his days balancing impossible choices. Trade brought guns and wealth. It also brought chains. Refuse the Portuguese and risk war. Trust them and risk losing everything anyway. Nzinga grew up listening to these arguments echo through palace courtyards. While other girls were taught only the quiet arts, she learned the language of crisis. She watched delegations come and go. She saw how gifts could be weapons, how smiles could be threats, how promises could dissolve like sugar in water. From an early age, she understood something simple and brutal. The world was changing, and it would not wait for anyone to catch up. So Nzinga did what clever children do. She paid attention. The making of a diplomat. Nzinga was not raised to be ordinary. Her father recognized her sharp mind the way a blacksmith recognizes good iron. Instead of pushing her to the edges of court life, he kept her close. She listened while men negotiated borders and alliances. She watched how leaders bowed and how others refused to. She learned languages as easily as breathing. Kimbundu, the tongue of her people; Portuguese, the language of the intruders. The subtle dialects of neighboring kingdoms, words became her first weapons. While many rulers shouted, Nzinga learned to persuade. While others relied only on spears, she learned the art of patience, the value of silence, the power of choosing exactly the right sentence at exactly the right time. She also learned something far more dangerous. She learned how Europeans thought, how they divided and conquered, how they smiled while stealing, how they respected only those strong enough to resist them. Most important of all, Nzinga learned never to trust a handshake that came with a cross and a contract. These lessons sank deep. One day, they would save her life. The crisis of a kingdom. By the time Nzinga was a young woman, Ndongo stood on the edge of collapse. Her father died, her brother became king, and almost immediately, the weight of the Portuguese pressed harder than ever. Slave raids grew bolder. Entire villages were emptied to fill European ships. Treaties meant to protect Ndongo were twisted into tools of control. Missionaries preached peace, while soldiers sharpened blades. Nzinga watched her brother struggle beneath it all. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to protect his people. But the Portuguese played a game he did not fully understand. A game with rules written far away, in places that did not care what happened to African kings. The kingdom needed more than bravery. It needed cunning. And as the situation worsened, it became clear that one man alone could not save Ndongo. An unexpected solution stepped forward: Nzinga. The famous meeting. In 1622, desperation opened a door. The Portuguese governor demanded negotiations. Ndongo needed peace. Someone had to go and speak for the kingdom, someone clever enough to face the foreigners on their own ground. Nzinga was chosen. She traveled to the coastal city of Luanda, dressed as a royal ambassador, carrying the hopes of her people on her shoulders. The Portuguese expected a nervous African princess. They were in for a surprise. When Nzinga entered the governor's chamber, she found a calculated insult waiting for her. A fine chair for him, and nothing for her but a simple mat on the floor. It was a message without words. You are beneath us. Nzinga did not hesitate. She turned to one of her servants and ordered him to kneel on his hands and knees. Then, with calm grace, she sat on his back as if it were a throne. The room went silent. In that single act, she announced to Portugal and to history that she would not bow to anyone. The negotiations that followed were brilliant. Nzinga spoke in fluent Portuguese. She argued, reasoned, and maneuvered until she secured a treaty meant to protect Ndongo from further raids. She walked out a legend. But legends are dangerous things, because Portugal never had any intention of keeping its word. A treaty and a trap. Nzinga returned home to Ndongo as a hero. Her people celebrated, her brother embraced her. For a brief shining moment, it seemed as if clever words and steady nerves had done what armies could not, bought peace for a battered kingdom. But Portugal had a different definition of peace. On paper, the treaty promised an end to slave raids, fair trade, and respect for Ndongo's sovereignty. In reality, Portuguese captains treated the ink like water. Raids continued, villages still burned, chains still clinked in the dark. The agreement Nzinga had fought so hard to secure turned out to be little more than a polite lie. It was her first brutal lesson in European diplomacy. Treaties, she realized, were only as strong as the people willing to break them. Anger simmered across the kingdom. Trust evaporated. Nzinga understood that words alone would never protect her people. If Ndongo was to survive, it would need more than promises. It would need a ruler willing to fight. A crown earned in blood. Not long after the failed treaty, Nzinga's world shattered again. Her brother died, some say by his own hand, others whispering darker rumors. However it happened, the result was the same. Ndongo was suddenly leaderless, fragile, and surrounded by enemies eager to tear it apart. Rivals stepped forward immediately. Powerful men insisted that a woman could never rule. Tradition, they claimed, demanded a male king. Nzinga listened to them all. Then she took the throne anyway. She declared herself ruler of Ndongo, refusing to let the future of her people be decided by men too frightened to act. Opposition rose quickly. Some nobles rebelled, others plotted. Portugal, sensing weakness, prepared to tighten its grip. Nzinga answered each challenge with the tools she knew best: strategy, speed, and an iron will. She executed traitors, She rewarded loyalty. She moved through the chaos like a storm with a plan, proving in brutal, efficient ways that she was not a placeholder. She was a queen. Queen of Ndongo. Power fit Nzinga like armor. She had been forging her entire life. As queen, she reorganized her armies, placing commanders loyal to her vision. She strengthened alliances with neighboring kingdoms who also feared Portuguese hunger. She fortified borders and protected trade routes, and most importantly, she fought back. Where slave raiders struck, her soldiers struck harder. Where Portuguese forts tried to tighten their hold, Nzinga found ways to weaken them. She turned the jungles and rivers of Angola into shields and weapons. Her court became a place of discipline and purpose. Men who had once doubted her learned quickly to respect her. Women who had been pushed aside saw in her a new kind of possibility. The Portuguese began to understand something uncomfortable. This queen would not be easy to remove. War with an empire. Portugal responded the way empires always do when challenged, with force. Battles erupted across Ndongo. Guns and cannons faced spears and bows. European soldiers expected quick victories against what they considered lesser armies. They underestimated Nzinga. She refused to fight on their terms. Instead, she mastered the art of the unexpected. Ambushes in thick forests, night attacks along narrow rivers, alliances that shifted like the tides. Years stretched into decades of conflict. Nzinga moved constantly, leading troops, planning campaigns, keeping her kingdom alive through sheer force of intelligence. She turned survival into an art form. To the Portuguese, she became more than an enemy. She became a problem with a crown. And when pressure on Ndongo grew unbearable, Nzinga did something extraordinary. She refused to be defeated. The exile and the reinvention. Eventually, the weight of war forced her from Ndongo. Many rulers would have surrendered then, fading quietly into history as another failed rebel. Nzinga chose a different path. She marched west and took control of a neighboring kingdom, Matamba. If she could not rule one throne, she would simply take another. In Matamba, she rebuilt everything: her army, her court, her power. She welcomed refugees and escaped slaves, turning them into loyal soldiers. She transformed a struggling territory into a military state that answered only to her. Portugal thought they had driven her away. Instead, they had given her room to grow stronger. Nzinga was not running. She was preparing. The unbreakable queen. Matamba became Nzinga's fortress and her proving ground. From this new throne, she ruled with the discipline of a general and the vision of a stateswoman. She opened her borders to anyone fleeing Portuguese brutality, escaped slaves, displaced families, rival warriors who preferred her leadership to foreign chains. What others saw as scattered refugees, Nzinga saw as an army in waiting. She trained them, armed them, united them. Her kingdom grew tougher by the year. Farms were protected, trade routes were guarded. Matamba became a thorn in Portugal's side, small on the map, enormous in spirit. European officers complained about her endlessly. They called her stubborn, impossible, defiant. Nzinga considered those compliments. She adapted to every new tactic the Portuguese tried. When they built forts, she cut off supplies. When they marched armies inland, she melted into the forests and struck from shadows. When they tried to divide African kingdoms against each other, she stitched new alliances together like a master tailor. Empires depend on fear. Nzinga refused to be afraid. Chess games with empires. Nzinga understood something many rulers never learn. War is only one language of power. Diplomacy is another, and she spoke it fluently. When the Dutch arrived on the African coast looking to challenge Portuguese control, Nzinga saw opportunity instead of danger. She formed alliances with them, trading cooperation for weapons and support. To Portugal, this was infuriating. To Nzinga, it was simply smart. She played European powers against each other the way gamblers play cards, calmly, carefully, always keeping her true intentions close to her chest. One year she fought beside the Dutch. The next she negotiated with the Portuguese. Always she kept Matamba free. Foreign governors found themselves tangled in webs they never quite understood. They expected an African queen to be simple, predictable. Nzinga was neither. Every treaty she signed with her fingers crossed behind her back, ready to break it the moment it stopped serving her people. Empires hated that. They also couldn't stop it. Victory through survival. Years turned into decades. Battles flared and faded. Governors came and went. European kings grew old and were replaced by new ones with the same greedy appetites. And still, Nzinga remained. She outlived enemies. She outlasted armies. She simply refused to disappear. By the time she reached her later years, even Portugal had to admit what had once seemed impossible. This woman would not be conquered. At last, weary of endless war, they returned to the negotiating table, this time on far more equal terms. Treaties were signed that recognized her rule. Slave raids slowed, borders stabilized. Matamba stood secure. Nzinga had done what no one believed could be done. She had forced an empire to compromise. Not with cannons, not with numbers, but with sheer, stubborn endurance. The long reign. Nzinga ruled longer than almost anyone expected, into her 70s, into her 80s. An age when most rulers were memories, she was still giving orders, still shaping policy, still reminding the world that power does not fade simply because a woman grows older. Travelers who visited her court spoke of a sharp-minded queen with eyes that missed nothing. Soldiers still feared her. Diplomats still tread carefully in her presence. She became more than a monarch. She became a symbol. To her people, she was proof that Angola did not have to bow its head to Europe. To enslaved men and women across the coast, she was a distant hope, a ruler who fought for them when so many others sold them away. And to Portugal, she remained what she had always been, the problem they never solved. Legacy written in defiance. Nzinga died in 1663, having spent a lifetime refusing to be small. She left behind a kingdom stronger than the one she inherited. She left behind borders that held, traditions that endured, and a story that traveled far beyond Angola's forests. Colonial powers would continue to push and steal and conquer for centuries. But her name became a shield. Generations later, freedom fighters, poets, and leaders would point back to her and say, "See, resistance is possible. A single determined mind can stand against the tide." Empires prefer their opponents to be quiet and forgettable. Nzinga was neither. Picture her at the end, an old queen seated on a carved wooden throne, sunlight filtering through tall trees, drums echoing faintly in the distance. Lines on her face that speak of battles fought and won, eyes still bright with that familiar, unbreakable fire. Portugal tried to humble her. Tradition tried to silence her. History tried to shrink her. None of it worked. Nzinga never knelt, never surrendered, never bowed. And that, more than any treaty or victory, is why the world still remembers her. Empires invade. Queens endure. If you felt the fire in her spirit and the iron in her spine, don't let her story fade back into the jungle shadows. History is full of women who refused the cage, who learned to bite back, and who carved their names into the world so the rest of us could walk a little taller. Subscribe as we continue to exhume the lives of the dark heroines. Next time, we leave the forests of Angola and travel north to the mountains and cathedrals of medieval Georgia. We're meeting a queen who ruled in a man's world, expanded her kingdom with brilliance, and built a golden age while enemies whispered that a woman could never wear a crown. Next time, Tamar of Georgia, the queen who ruled like a king. Stay dangerous, stay loud, and never let them hold the pen.